to introduce some very good friends of mine. First, Monica Chambers from the Colorado Department of Corrections, and Carrie Schmidt, who is also an adjunct professor here for us at UCCS. So help me welcome them.
Well, thank you all for coming. I see a couple of my students, which is terrific. The rest of the folks in the audience, how many of you are CJ majors? Pretty much everybody else, right? Okay. This program, I'll have Monica talk a little bit about the inception of it and kind of the background of it. How many of you have heard of restorative justice? A few of you? Does anybody want to tell us what it is? Yeah? Anybody? Yeah? No takers, huh? Restorative justice is an alternative to the traditional criminal justice system. And instead of focusing on punishment, we focus on repairing the harm that was caused. One of the offshoots of that, or benefits of that, is hopefully it restores relationships. It also allows people to be accountable for what they did in a way that encourages remorse and accountability instead of sifting people or looking them into a shame spiral. And so this victim offender dialogue is one of the restorative practices. There are a number of different types of methods or practices that are used in restorative justice. Circles sometimes. Has anybody heard of circle processes? Circle facilitated processes? Okay. Victim offender conferencing, victim offender dialogue, restorative mediation. Those are all formats for the implementation of this philosophy of restorative justice, which is really this body of knowledge about accountability and repairing harm. And so a few years ago, when did you start really working on this? About 6 years ago, 7 years ago?
2004.
2004. Oh, 11 years ago.
It flopped for a while.
Then it came back. And so Monica is head of victim services for the Department of Corrections, and she is really the brilliant person behind this project. And so I want her to introduce a little bit about how this came about and her involvement in the process, and then we're going to share with you a presentation about victim offender dialogue. So Monica, do you want to?
Sure. Thank you guys for being here, and thank you, Katie. She invited me here back from her old stomping grounds at DOC. I've been there about 18, 19 years. I've worked in some facilities. I worked as a correctional officer for a few years. I've been in the executive director's office. I worked as an assistant to 3 of them, I believe. And about 5 years ago, I started doing the victim services unit. So there's a couple slides in here that I could tell you a little bit about what that is. And if you have any questions, please just holler about DOC or the program or what my office does. We are obligated by the Victims' Rights Act of Colorado for victims of violent crime. And we send notifications out each year. I think I have some slides on that, don't I? So I'll get into that just a little bit. But this program really took effect in about 2011 before our executive director, Tom Clements, was murdered. He asked me to facilitate 2 victim offender dialogues to gauge resources that we would need to be able to make this program happen. And there was some legislation in the 2011 session that prompted us to do that. So we did a few pilot program dialogues, and then we've had, I think, 4 or 5 since the policy's been signed, but we'll get into that with some of the slides. Before Mr. Clements died again, we did an executive strategic planning session, probably in about 2006, and we rewrote the DOC's mission statement, value statements, and vision statement. So we came up with just a short and sweet vision statement of building a safer Colorado for today and tomorrow. Obviously, a lot of that is custody and control of offenders and making sure that the community's safe. But also part of that obligation, which I was really glad to see make it up past the top 10, is honoring and respecting the rights of victims. Because very often in the criminal justice system, victims are forgotten. It's not the victim justice system. So most everything is geared toward assuring the offender's rights and very often the victims get forgotten and all that. So that's part of the reason I do what I do every day and try to make these things happen, because they do get forgotten. So, I don't know if anybody in here is old enough to remember, but a couple of us maybe, when the attempted assassination happened on Ronald Reagan, when John Hinckley Jr. tried to kill him. That's what prompted the federal level of Victims' Rights Act to come about, because President Reagan realized he didn't really have a voice in the court system. None of his input was allowed for sentencing or any of those kind of things when the plea bargaining process or any of that came around. So he created a task force in 1984 that said that the victim's rights should be adhered to just as vigorously as the criminal defendant. So that's the basis of where all the state amendments have come down from, is honoring and respecting the rights of victims. They have to be treated with fairness, dignity, and respect. I think there was a lot of years where people couldn't participate in the system. I have a friend whose daughter was murdered, and she was pregnant at the time. They weren't allowed in the courtroom. They didn't even know all of those details until after the court proceedings happened, because they were sequestered from everything. They weren't allowed in the room. So the laws have come a long way, and Colorado really has come leaps and bounds. We had the Victims' Rights Act come into play in Colorado in the 1992 legislative session, and that next year, in 93, is when the Victim Services Unit was established. And it consisted of one person for a long time.
You.
Well, no, there was one person has done this job before me. Do you remember Rose Young?
Yes.
Rose did this job for years until she retired, and I took the position, but it's kind of an unknown. There's still people in DOC, I think, that don't even know this unit exists. In fact, I know. So that's just the history of what the background for DOC Victim Services is. And of course, we have a policy for absolutely everything that occurs in the Department of Corrections. We have a victim notification program policy, and that outlines all of the critical stages that we have to send notices to the victims of violent crime enrolled in our program. Now I have closer to 6,900, I guess I need to update that, and we send out at least 35,000 notifications every year, and I have 2 administrative assistants in my office that do the bulk of that work, so we gurgle for air a lot.
Can you tell them an example of why victims want to, what you would notify the victims of?
Some of the things that we notify folks of is the location of the offender. They want to know where they're at. We notify them when parole board hearings are coming and they want to come to the proceeding and have a voice with the decision makers. They also can come when an offender is trying to go to a halfway house and be placed in community corrections. We let them know if the offender dies. And of course, if there were an execution, that may not ever happen in Colorado again, but that's part of that process. And everything that we do in post-conviction beyond the courts, things happen in open court and victims give their statements then, and it's public information. When post-sentencing comes around, everything is confidential. We don't tell the offenders that there is a victim enrolled in their case, and we never share any of their private information, or we never share any of the written statements that they provide to the parole board or community corrections boards. Those are all confidential.
I don't want to keep interrupting you, but they don't know this stuff and it's important stuff.
Sure, sure.
Could you talk a little bit about good time and why it's confusing to a victim when their offender's been given a life sentence and now they get a notice from your office saying that he's available for parole or she's available for parole?
Yeah, what's really confusing and what we do a lot during the day, spending time on the phone educating victims, if an offender is sentenced to 20 years, that does not mean 20 years in prison. People really don't understand that, and very often the DAs don't provide that information. Those offenders who've not committed a class 1 or 2 felony are eligible for parole automatically at 50% of their sentence. And then that chunk of percentage of time is called good time. That's right off the top. As soon as they hit DOC, the minimus comes from the court and we give them 50%. That determines their parole eligibility date. Up to 19 months before that, they can apply to go to community corrections. So 20 years does not mean a 20-year incarceration by any means. Many, many offenders are out in the community in a halfway house at about 33% of their sentence. And victims don't know that necessarily when the plea bargaining process happens or when an offender is sentenced and they call and scream at us, I just saw this dude at Walmart, it's only been 3.5 years, what's going on? And that's because if they have behaved and not gotten in trouble and applied at every point where they could to get released early, they can get out. They can earn 10 days a month if they don't get any institutional write-ups. We have a code of penal discipline, and if they don't have any write-ups or violations of that code, they can earn 10 days a month. In 2012, more legislation came through that allows the offenders to earn achievement earned time. If they get a GED, they might get another 120 days of earned time. If they complete sex offender treatment program, a certain amount of days for each phase. If they get a certificate to operate heavy equipment out of Buena Vista, they're going to get more days. So they can cut their sentence literally by 2/3 or more. So it's a real bone of contention and misunderstanding, and my staff get a lot of earfuls and a lot of screaming at because people don't know that. And we get to be the bearer of bad news just about every day. So, is that what you were after?
Yeah, so one of the things that is showing up is that a victim hears life sentence. So they may choose to not enroll in this victim notification program because why would they need to know? Because they're locked up for life, right? And then there's no way to contact them because people move and it's hard to track them down. And so this has been one of the challenges because victim offender dialogue practices are totally voluntary, but they have to be victim initiated. And so if you don't have the victim that knows about the program because they haven't been notified, that makes it really difficult.
The laws changed a lot about 1993. There used to be some old life sentences. Life used to be 40 years, then life became 20 years, then it became 10 years. And then it changed to life without parole, or 40 to life. So the laws have changed a lot over the years, and part of that is really complicated too. It's kind of like brain surgery when you go to time computation for the Department of Corrections. It's super confusing, but what people need to take away from that is a 20-year sentence doesn't mean 20 years. That's my point in all that. So I talked a little bit about the legislation in 2011. In 2014 legislative session, I was allotted a little bit of money. The Department of Corrections overall budget is $782 million, I think. It might be a little bit more this year. I haven't seen the long bill request, but out of that huge amount that the Department of Corrections receives every year, I get $75,000 to do this victim offender dialogue program. So what I did was I enlisted a man from Maine who teaches in departments of corrections across the country, teaches people how to facilitate these dialogues. So I got a group together and we trained about 10 of us. Carrie and I have done some together and we'll talk a little bit more about those. But at this point, 32 states have a victim offender dialogue program. Some states began as early as the 90s. I think Texas started in 92. And I believe they've completed over 600 victim offender dialogues since then, and all safely and successfully. Colorado's a little bit slower in getting on board for that and having the funding to do it, but I'm working on that. You might often hear the words high risk in front of the words of victim offender dialogue. And a lot of times people think high risk is simply because they're in prison. But there's some other factors that really need to be considered. What I consider high risk are those offenders who committed sexual assault, stalking, domestic violence. There's a whole nother layer of dynamics with those offenders, with manipulation and all those things that if we don't do it very carefully and very correctly with very trained people, you're going to cause more harm. And that's the very last thing we want to do in a restorative justice process or program is to cause more harm. So we're not doing these right now. Our executive staff would really like to see us get a few more years under our belt and some more funding to maybe hire folks who are specifically trained to work with sex offenders and DV offenders. Also, the flip side is the victimization and people that can work with victims of those crimes. So may seem kind of odd that a regular murder, we can handle that, and I don't consider it high risk, but I do consider sex assault high risk. You want to talk about this slide, Carrie?
Yeah, so the victims have to be in the Department of Corrections opt-in victim notification, which is what we were just talking about. And this program is for severe and violent crimes, and it's a bit of a head scratcher sometimes for people to understand why would the victim survivor, typically it's a family member of someone who has been murdered, either a vehicular homicide or murder 1 or murder 2 are the main ones that we're doing right now. Why in the world would they want to sit down and talk to the offender? Does that surprise anybody? If you put yourself in that situation, if you were the surviving family member and your loved one had been murdered, why do you think you would want to sit down and talk to the offender?
Closure.
Say that again?
Closure.
Closure. Okay, what do you mean by closure?
There's a lot of, with so much grief after a traumatic situation, especially involving death, murder, a lot of individuals, they go through the grief cycle, and they ask a lot of questions such as, why did this happen? Why me? Why did you do that? And they feel some type of closure at times asking those questions, even if it provides no answer.
And one of the things that we're very careful of when we're working with victims and victim survivors is to not use the word closure. And the reason being is for some people, they perceive that to be diminutive of the experience that they've gone through. For other people, they say, yes, I want closure. So it's really interesting. So when you're working with victims, that's something to be aware of, is there are certain hot button words that can trigger them.
Can I say something to that? The word closure to some people use it, some survivors of homicide use that, but they very often think it makes people think you're done now and you're over it. And you never get over it. How do you close the chapter of your son being murdered? But the word I like to use that's much better is clarity, because you nailed it right on the head of the nail, is answers to questions. And sometimes it's why, sometimes it's way deeper than that. But that's the whole point of, I think, where we were headed. And I learned the hard way on some of those words that people take offensively, and for some people it doesn't bother them at all. Some people don't want us to call them victims. They don't like that. They want to be called survivors. So everybody kind of gauges it a little bit different, and they're wherever they're at in the process can make a big difference to how they react to stuff. So we just have to kind of gingerly approach some of those things and see where people see how they feel about it. So
Yeah, so a very good response, thank you. And so one of the things too that sometimes victims perceive is that if I get closure, that means I forget, and that's dishonoring their loved one. And so it's not, restorative practices and restorative justice is not about forgiveness. And this is really interesting because a lot of times victims will approach Monica and say, I want to talk to them, I want them to know that I forgive them. But forgiveness to victims does not mean forgetting, it does not mean condoning. It means letting go of the hold that it has on them. A great quote on forgiveness is letting go all hope of a better past. And that's really what it is for a lot of these victims, is letting go all hope that the situation could have been different. And so the forgiveness is letting go of the hold that it has on their heart, the anger that has really engulfed them because of this. And so when they have this conversation with the offender, many of them want them to understand as well the impact that this had on their life, on their family's life. They want them to understand what they took away. The thing that we hear very often is that you get to come back after your prison sentence and be with your family, but I never get to see my loved one again. And so this sense of unfairness. And so that's why when you're looking at criminal justice and justice, you really have to examine what does justice mean. And so restorative justice is unique in that it really gives the victims a voice in the outcome of the justice process that's been missing for many years in our traditional criminal justice system. So it's an awareness of victim needs and victim rights, as we've explained so far. So for the offender, they have to be sentenced to the Colorado Department of Corrections. And they have to be somehow affiliated with Department of Corrections. That might be in-house as a prison, or it could be a community corrections facility. They may be out on parole. We're going to show you some clips in this process, and one of the offenders is in street clothes, and that might seem a little odd to you, but that's because he's out on parole right now.
One of the big things that's confusing for people too, a lot of folks don't know the difference between probation and parole. I'm hoping all of you guys do at this point, but probation comes before prison, and parole is the transition out of prison. It's still kind of interesting to hear people talk about it because a lot of them don't know the difference, and it is very different. So none of the cases I can do are probation offenders. They're all going to be in a prison, a transition halfway house, or a DOC parolee. And the halfway houses too, they hold two different kinds of populations. Judges can obviously sentence an offender directly to community corrections, and they may be in a halfway house as a direct sentence. When they're coming from parole or from prison, they're half in, half out of prison, they're a transition client. So there's two populations always housed in community corrections, and that gets confusing sometimes.
So ComCorp, are you all familiar with ComCorp here in town? Anybody visited ComCorp? You toured it? ComCorp is a community corrections, community corrections program. So it is one of those transitional units to get them back out on the street. So the principles of victim-offender dialogue is that it's got to be victim-initiated, as I said at the beginning. It's victim-centered, but it's offender-sensitive. And what I mean by that is the focus is on getting the answers to victim questions and having them have an opportunity to have a voice with the offender. But if you had a victim that came in and just blasted the offender, it's not safe for the offender. And part of the thing that we do in this, and we'll go into it a little bit further, is that it's not just a one-time event. We do a lot of pre-work with both the victims and the offenders to give them a sense of safety, to build trust between them and the facilitator, to know that they can be vulnerable in these conversations. We also provide them some skills, so we might help with some of the languaging. For example, in a DUI situation, vehicular homicide, offenders commonly will refer to that as an accident. Victims don't think it was an accident. If you have a history of DUIs and you now hit and kill my loved one, it was on purpose. In their mind, it's on purpose. And so it wasn't an accident, it was a choice. And so helping them with some of the language of accountability needs to be done. But it's also giving them a path to kind of follow of understanding about how you get to where you are now, to a place where you can be open and honest and vulnerable with your victim or with your offender and allow a very deep conversation about what matters most to you. These are confidential, they are not recorded at this time, so it's a one-time event. There's conferencing with a facilitator leading up to it, but the actual event only happens once. Those meetings typically last anywhere from about 3 to 6 hours, 4 to 6 on the average. And we've been scheduling them typically to start around 9, 10 in the morning because they're usually held at the prison unless the offender is out in community corrections. It may be held in the community. But the prisons, because most of them are quite a drive, normally 10 o'clock is a good start time. But the other reason we do that is that we'll take a break for lunch. And the victims are always given the opportunity, you typically will have lunch brought in, or they'll eat in the prison, in a room in the prison. Prior to the dialogue, frequently they'll say, we just want to eat by ourselves. We don't want to eat with the offender. But so far, everyone that we've done, when it comes time to break for lunch, the victims oftentimes request that the offender join them for lunch, which is really kind of an interesting conversation that they break bread together. It is all volunteer, and the beauty of this is that at any point in time in the process, I talked about these pre-conference meetings, these can last from a couple months to up to a year. But the pre-conference meetings usually are an hour or two with an offender or with a victim. And if they find that it's just too uncomfortable, that it's touching some areas that they just can't deal with, they can stop the process at any time. And so both the offender can do that and the victim can do that. So it's not, once you're in, you have to do it. And probably most important is it's safe. And the safety is to increase that vulnerability or allow for the vulnerability in the conversation between the two.
One question I get asked a lot is that offender in handcuffs and restrained for the dialogue? And no. If I think he needs to be in handcuffs, he's not going to be in a room with the victim doing this dialogue. So these guys are very carefully screened. I'm super picky about how that's going to look and who gets to do it. And if I have any inkling at all that there might be any threat of violence, anything, verbal abuse, any of that, it's not going to happen. So no, they're not going to be restrained. They're going to be sitting across from a victim at a small table with the facilitators. So never once have I had that fear that something would not be safe, and if it came to that point, it just wouldn't happen. And we would know that, I think, long before during those preparation meetings.
Yeah, I think one of the concerns of the offenders frequently is they're not sure they can answer the question for the victim. If they get to the point where they're offered the opportunity for this, they've been screened very carefully, they realize that this is their one opportunity to repay back in some small way the debt that has been imposed upon them because of their negative behavior, because of their action of typically a murder.
And I think when we show you guys these clips, all that
It's going to come.
will sound differently when you actually hear from some people who've actually been through the process. We hired a videographer recently. We have a rough cut that we just got yesterday on this DVD that we're making for educational purposes about this program. And there's some clips in here from that DVD where offenders and victims who've been through the process give you a little snippet of information. I think some of that will ring a little bit more true when you see the people talking.
So we talked about that they can withdraw at any time, either side. There's no media involvement. Any idea why we wouldn't want media involved? Anybody want to take a shot at that one? Why would we not want to record this and put it out in the news media? Yeah.
You just don't want everybody's information out there floating around.
Confidentiality is certainly important. We've committed to them to be confidential. Any other ideas? Anybody else? Yeah. I'm sorry?
Well, I was just gonna say, when it comes to the confidentiality, you would want to ensure that people can participate in this in the future, whether it's the victim or the offender. And if media involvement, whether it's negative or positive, it could highly affect a future victim's aspect if they want to be involved.
That's exactly right. And part of it too is if it's not a sensational enough video, the media is going to make it that way and cut out some things. There was a deal on Dr. Phil a few years ago, and he went sideways trying to get a victim and an offender together, and it really tainted the whole process for what it really is, because the media won't be interested unless they can sensationalize it. So we don't want to jeopardize the integrity of the program, the intent of the program, or have future people that may want to do it be afraid to do it because of what the media did with it. So that's one reason I'm making this DVD, is to show what it really means. And the media very often spins things to a different level that we don't want to see happen. And it can change the dynamic of that group in the dialogue. People behave differently with cameras, and offenders certainly would behave differently with cameras. Victims might be less likely to be as forthright, thinking that other people are going to look at this later. So it's very private, very confidential. We just take all those other elements out of the picture so it can be its true intent.
This alternative options is really important because not everybody, once they start going through the pre-conferencing, needs to have a one-on-one, face-to-face conversation. So sometimes we found that maybe a letter exchange has gotten the answers that the victim needs. We've done some hybrid things. We've got a case going right now where we're probably going to be doing the pre-conferencing because the woman lives out of state. We'll do the pre-conferencing on Google Hangouts or Skype. She'll actually come in for the dialogue, but the pre-conferencing could be done online. So we're trying to utilize some technology if we can.
I was just along those lines, I just had a question. Is the department open to this in higher classifications? Are there any kind of limitations on the higher classification facilities?
the policy says max offenders aren't gonna do it. And the reality of that, Katie, is if they've earned their way to max, they're probably not a good candidate for this program anyway. It's all a global picture of how they behaved, where they're at. And my feeling is if they're that high in classification, they're probably not the right person to sit down with the victim. So most of the guys we've had are close and medium because they got long sentences.
Yeah.
So it's more about, and I think the policy says close or below.
Yeah.
And now, of course, we've gotten rid of administrative segregation. So even the death penalty offenders in Colorado now are not maximum security. They're in close custody.
So that's a different translation than for you.
Go ahead.
Any other questions? Okay. And as I said, this is a one-time event.
These are just some summary dates, kind of showing you what the crimes are and when we completed these dialogues. Murder cases and vehicular homicides seem to be where people are looking and searching and pressing for the most answers. This case resulted in a death, but the offender wasn't convicted of causing the death. So in each case that we've done, someone has died. And there are probably other cases that are gonna work out just fine in the future. We're just kind of getting started. We haven't got 1, 2, 3, 4 done. We're working on 5 and 6 right now. So you can see it's just very clear that the people who want and need this program the most are the ones who've lost a loved one. So I think on the next slide it shows a snapshot of, and this can change just about every day. We have probably 2 more than this right now that are getting ready to go, and I have a bunch more. I think I have about 100 requests on file. Some of those are from offenders, which is awesome, but I can't make it happen for them. I think if I were to come to a victim who's in a spot in their grief cycle, that hearing that for me would do more harm than good, because again, that's giving offenders control. The victim has had control of nothing for this whole time. The survivors have had no control. And that's just another bone of contention where the offenders asserted some control. So the way I work around that is making people aware of the program, who I can, and if they're interested, they'll come to me. There's a lot of offenders that have heard about some of these that have happened and write and really want to do it, and I think that's awesome, but I can't call the victim and say, hey, the dude that killed your daughter wants to see you. That's not gonna fly. They need to come to us on their own time when they're ready, because if they're not ready, it could be much more harmful. So this list changes all the time, but lots going on.
And it could be, I mean, when we do the pre-evaluation, evaluation phase, we'll go back and look at letters to the parole board, you know, a year or 2 years ago where they're saying, absolutely do not give the parole, you know, and list a whole bunch of reasons. And then a year later, they want to have a victim offender dialogue. So it's just where they are in their own process, and I think that's one of the most critical things in any restorative practice. You've got to meet people where they are, not where you think they should be.
In your opinion, how impactful is participation in this program to the parole board?
When the offenders sign up to do this, they sign an agreement that says the intention of this program and mine is not to benefit me in any way for release, a better cell, getting into a program, nothing. They have to go into this and sign an agreement that says my intentions are true to serve the victim. If they mention it at a parole board hearing, they mention it. The parole board knows about it. I presented this to them so they're aware if someone would talk about it. And I think in one case they had, and during a full board review, the chair asked this victim, would you feel this way today, because she wanted him released. Would you feel this way today had you not gone through the dialogue? And she said, probably not, no. But they're not supposed to use it to say, hey, I did this. You know, and most of them that have come this far, I don't think are going to try to do it that way, because once they've been through it and they see what it's done for them, they don't have any desire to exploit that, really. And you'll see when you see some of these guys talking, how impactful it is to them. And I'll tell them before they start, you have no idea what this is gonna do for you. No, I just wanna do what I can for her and answer those questions I have to. It's a debt I can never repay, blah, blah, blah. And after the dialogue, they'll say, man, you were right. I can't even believe this, how much better I feel. It'll be cool to see the clips, you'll see what I mean.
What's interesting is when Monica goes out to tell the offender, and there's no notification that she's coming, that they are a candidate for this program, and it's been requested by the surviving family member. There is this sense of, oh my gosh, it's almost unbelievable that they would be willing to talk to me, that they would be willing to see me for who I am as a person, not what I did. It's an amazing experience.
And the offenders who are ripe for this program, I think there's a couple slides. This is not for everybody. This is not going to fit every case. There's no way that every victim would want to do this, and there's no way that every offender could do this or would do this. But the ones who are ready to do it have thought about it for a long time, and they wish they could have apologized in court. They wish they could have written a letter and done something to show some remorse after they were convicted, and they can't do that because they don't allow, it's very adversarial in the courtroom process, and then when they get sentenced to DOC, there's no contact allowed. So they don't even have the opportunity to say, I'm sorry, which sometimes is the only reason victims come to parole board hearings. They want to look for that. They want to see if somebody's accountable and remorseful. So when they get to that place, they're usually so happy to have an opportunity to finally do it. If they're not, I'm probably not going to move forward with it. It's a real small, select bunch of people that really fit this mold. Not your everyday cases necessarily. You know, the guys that have a real deep criminal vein, the sociopaths, psychopaths, those guys aren't going to be in the room. It's usually cases like this where there was a death involved, and maybe that guy wasn't a horrible, deep vein criminal, but he got caught in the love triangle and did something really stupid, or the guy who got drunk and killed his friend. Anyway.
So you may have heard of victim-offender dialogue and victim-offender mediation, and there's a very clear distinction between the two. Victim-offender dialogue focuses on the needs of the victim, and that's what this program is. We're really focusing on the needs of the program and being sensitive to the needs of the offender. In a victim-offender mediation, typically these are used for low-level crimes. We do these a lot in the 4th Judicial. We do them through the Neighborhood Justice Center. We do them through the courts, and if you'd like some more information on that, or you'd like to see that process, let me know. It's usually some kind of a negotiation with an agreement at the end of it. So it could be assault charges. We do them up to felony 3s in El Paso County. It could be assault, it could be vandalism, it could be harassment. We do victim-offender mediation a lot in the school system, so that's a restorative practice that's very common. But it ends up with a settlement agreement. The difference between a victim-offender mediation and a victim-offender dialogue is there's nothing to negotiate. It's over, it's happened. What this is an opportunity for conversation, to gain understanding, to have the offender be accountable in a way that has meaning and significance to the victim. And it's really about healing and reconstruction. There is no agreement. If we were to have an agreement, say the offender agrees to write an apology letter to the victim's family on the anniversary of the death, which in some states they do agreements. We don't here in Colorado, but the reason we don't is because if that doesn't happen, if they don't follow up, then it re-victimizes the victim. And so it's just better to stay away from those agreements, we found. So as we've said, it's not for everyone. And Monica's been in the Department of Corrections for how many years now? 18, 20? She's got a really good sense of, is an offender ready for this and really appropriate for this case. I've really been amazed at her antenna for sincerity and for honesty and for accountability. But it doesn't work for everybody, and that's why she's so picky about who gets into this program.
That's what I mentioned a little bit ago, I think, Katie, that it's, and victims ask that very often. It's sometimes one of their first concerns. Well, is this gonna get him paroled? Is this gonna get him released early? And no, that's not the intent of it at all, and everybody's aware of that from the very beginning. And the people who facilitate this in this scenario is not about therapy. We're not therapists, and the session is not meant for therapy. The results can be, and most often that I've ever seen, have been very therapeutic, but the intent going in is not to fix somebody. The intent is to serve their needs, to understand and have answers. And on the offender side, it's their need to be able to finally say it. So those things have a therapeutic effect, but these folks that do it, I mean, the setting is not a therapy session. So that's something that confuses people a lot. And forgiveness, Carrie already talked about that. We don't even say the word forgiveness unless somebody else says it first. That's a very personal choice. Everybody has a different definition of it. And if they feel that's where they're at, that's fine. I'm not here to tell them where I expect them to be. That's entirely up to them. And in some cases, it's happened where there's no intention of it, but it happens that day. Sometimes it's never mentioned. Sometimes that's the reason they come to me. But I will never mention it as something they should consider, should think about. Nothing. That's entirely a very personal choice. So that's not on the table.
I want to add something to the therapy piece, because when we have these conversations, we're often getting into some very deep feelings and some things that have been suppressed for long periods of time. I was out at a prison yesterday interviewing an offender for possibly doing this, and he talked about, and this is something that we hear from offenders quite regularly, is that when they come into the prison system, they have to compartmentalize or put that offense almost on a shelf. Because if they relive it over and over day after day, it's very hard for them to survive in prison. And so sometimes they talk about putting it in boxes on a shelf. The guy yesterday said, I have a closet full of filthy rags. And those filthy rags are the things that I've said and done in my past. And they're about this incident. And he said, I don't like opening that closet. But if it means that it could provide some healing to this victim's family, I will happily bring out those filthy rags and show them.
At what point in the process are they presented with the opportunity? Is it
That's coming up
initial?
here real soon.
Okay.
Yeah, I've got it lined out in the initiation by the victim and then what happens. So there's a bullet point list coming up here in just a minute. That'll make it real clear.
So one of the things that we want to make sure that they have a support system, the offenders have a support system that they can go to and talk about things. So there is therapy in the prisons.
Yeah, we make sure mental health is aware because we want that offender to be healthy in the process too. If they're not going to be able to serve the victim, for one thing. Plus, we don't want to damage them and have something happen in a facility to endanger our staff or endanger other offenders. It has to be everybody is well to come there and do that. We don't want to make anything worse for anybody. So they can see mental health anytime they want, not have to pay for it. They have, what, $3 co-pays? We make sure that if they need to talk to somebody at that point, they have the access to it without being charged for it. And I leave the door open for case managers to me for questions or anything along the way too. So it's really transparent and open. We don't hide anything. Yes, ma'am.
Sorry, I'm just drawing your question.
Please.
It's really interesting to me. Would there be, for example, if you had a situation where somebody was taking psychotropic medication, things like that, would mental health then potentially make a recommendation to you?
I would.
This is not a good candidate because of this medication.
If I was concerned about that, I'd look at their P codes and all those kind of things, and if it were anything of concern, I would bring a mental health professional to help me do an immutability interview. It's a case-by-case thing. I haven't ran into anybody yet who requested one with an offender who had mental illness issues. If they do, then I have mental health people that can help me, and I have lots of places to bounce it and evaluate from. That could get real tricky for somebody. Yeah.
What advice is given to the victim? Because you talked about the offender and everything that's offered to them, but since you're not counselors, or that's a whole different subject to get into, but
Yeah.
what is offered to the victim to let them know it's going to bring up, it's part of the grief cycle, it's
Yeah.
going to keep.
And that's usually part of the initial conversation with them. What's their support system? Are they seeking counseling? I can't provide counseling to someone who's not a DOC offender or staff, but I have resources in the community if I think someone needs it. And that we have one gal right now that I can't move forward with her until she gets some counseling. And so she's doing that. So they're our first concern on the initial conversation. The offender part comes a little bit later, but that's where I have a little more control. You know, does that make sense?
Yeah.
As far as forgiveness, I don't know if you can ever really completely forgive a person who kills your son. I think forgiveness some people think is too carelessly it was a closing I felt for my son.
Years for many of these after the incident. Patty and Jess was 4 years after the incident, or after the death of their loved one.
My one concern going into it was that the facilitators would expect some form of forgiveness from me. And I made it very clear in our initial dialogue that I had no intention of forgiving Andy, nor did I hold any positive feelings about him. In fact, I think I used the term that I would be happy, or that I would be happy with him dying under a bridge as a drunk, that I thought that was the future that he deserved. They, hearing all that, didn't seem to be offended by my hostile perspective, and they didn't expect me to forgive him or accept him, and that was okay with me.
Sorry about the pixels there.
I don't know
It
what-
doesn't really look like that.
Sometimes victims come in wanting or thinking that they have to forgive because it's been talked to them, oftentimes by their religious organization or affiliation, or there have been people that say you can't move on until you forgive. And so there's a bit of an unsettling we found, where that forgiveness is almost like imposed. They feel like that's what they're supposed to do, but they're just not there yet. So that's why oftentimes they talk about forgiveness. So this other piece is this unhappiness with the court process. In all the court trials I've been to, I've never seen two parties come out happy. And oftentimes the party who thinks they won or should have won thinks they didn't get as much as they should have. And so in the case with the offenders, they think the offenders should have gotten longer sentences, or they should have been punished somehow more. Or the victims think that the offenders should have been punished more. The offenders think they got too much. I mean, so it's a really awkward situation when you start to look at it from the perspective of what does the victim see, what does the victim need, what does the victim hear, and the same for the offender. And so this idea that the court process really kind of shifts victims to the side is prevalent, and we hear that a lot in the conversations from victims.
The court process, you had no control. The dialogue, you got control. And you were able to say, I want it to go like this. And what do you think about this? And can it happen like this? And it did.
So giving them control and giving them voice is huge. Here's another.
It was very hard too because they, it was more about how he felt and how it was affecting him instead of what it was doing to all of us. So it was hard. It was hard having him sit right there in that courtroom and be able to look at him.
We'll see if I can get to the third one here.
The court process,
This one should be Peggy.
It should be.
It was very hard too because they,
Let's see if we can get this one.
So I would say that it's very important, as a victim, the system has this tendency of pushing you away, whether they don't know what to say, they don't know how to deal with you, I don't know what it is. But as a victim, I needed to have an opportunity to speak. I needed to have an opportunity to go before Andy. And this program allowed me to have that.
the court process for a victim, in the criminal court, you have no voice at all. The offender has more of a voice than you do.
That's the common thing, and that's the common thinking of victims. And so this DOD really allows them to get those questions answered, to express how that crime has impacted their life, to obtain a personal sense of justice that they don't get through the criminal justice system, and to further their own healing process. And it's different for everybody. But by and large, the greatest thing they come away with is a sense of empowerment and a sense that a load has been lifted. We often hear, I feel lighter as the result of this conversation.
It was important for me to do a dialogue with Todd. I needed to know about my son's death, how it happened, why it happened. I needed him to be very specific about the details, so I didn't have to imagine in my mind anymore how my son died. I needed to know, did he struggle? Did he say anything? Did he suffer? I needed to know those things, and Todd was the only one that could answer those questions for me. And I had to wait 19 years to find out, and in that 19 years, there were a lot of scenarios that went through my mind, and the dialogue would put an end to that. I would finally know the answers to all those questions.
Again, I'm sorry about those pixels, it's kind of weird. I don't know why it's doing that.
Yeah, it's the first time it's done that. What we found is that oftentimes if victims don't get answers to questions, they make up answers in their mind. It's almost like Swiss cheese brain. You've got holes of the story, and so you plug them in with information that maybe someone gave you or something you read to try to make sense out of this horrendous situation. And sometimes they realize that the story that they've been telling themselves is not accurate all these years. And that's where the peace comes from, when they finally can put the pieces of the puzzle together and make sense. So some of the things that we want to make sure of when we're talking to the victims is that, what do you expect out of this program, and this conversation? Because their expectations may not be fully met. And so we want them going in with eyes wide open. The questions may not be fully answered. If you've been dealing with someone who behavioral homicide in a drug driving situation, they don't remember. They may remember that last beer that they had at the club, but they frequently will not remember the car crash. This is one. Do you want to talk about this one? Because
This one's kind of a tough one because there's been some folks who've really wanted to do this, and their family has been like, what the hell is wrong with you? Why would you want to do that? So we really have to consider some of those unintended consequences that could come for these victims. We've seen distraught families spread apart from the original tragedy and crime as it is, and sometimes this can put people further apart if somebody doesn't understand that. So that's another thing we are really mindful of, in making sure that their support system is solid and making sure that they have some place to reach out and get more help if they need it. We're really, really tuned into making sure that there's not any negative consequences coming from it. And some move ahead full steam knowing that. They don't care. This is my choice, But it's one of those things to be mindful, because a lot of people just really don't get it and have no desire to do it, which is fine. I respect that too. But big consideration with some of the cases we've had.
Yeah, so it's important when you do this work to understand the victim grief cycle in depth, and also realize that for some family members, they consider it a betrayal for you to talk to the person that destroyed their family, and that's a common comment that we hear. We've talked a lot about this high risk. The thing that's probably important about this situation is that Monica does not want these cases done within the first year of incarceration. Does anybody have any idea why? Why wouldn't you do them when an offender first goes to prison? Yeah.
The states just haven't cooled down yet, there hasn't been enough time.
Yeah.
Process stuff.
To process stuff, it's a
Yeah.
new environment. Yeah. Anybody else? They may still be in that mindset of, I didn't really do it, or I did it because, or they're not taking full accountability. They may not be there yet. So that's another important reason for this. The ones that we've been doing predominantly have been post-conviction years after, many years after the fact. We talked about this, that we're not currently doing them for sexual offenses, domestic violence, stalking, etc. And
after the dialogue was over and I walked out of the prison, I realized that I had my voice back again. I was definitely in control. I didn't have my complete identity back, and I realized that I never would. But I knew that I had a voice again, and that I was never going to be shut up again for any reason, that I was going to fight, that I, from that moment on, was a survivor. I was no longer just a victim. I will always be a victim, but I'm also now a survivor. And I am now creating my identity again. It'll never be the same, but at least I have an identity again.
Is anybody surprised by that? Have you ever thought about a victim's identity changing with a crime? Did that ever occur to you? This was huge because she was no longer Peggy. She was the mother of the murdered person, the murdered guy at the end of the street. This particular situation, her son was stabbed in his garage and nearly decapitated by his best friend. And so that house was like the house, the spooky house. And the house that you had to report before you sold it that a death had occurred in that house. A lot of controversy, a lot of things that pointed to her, and she had nothing to do with it, but it did change her identity. Not only the way she looked at herself, but the way the world looked at her. Do you want to?
This is just a quick little nutshell of the 3 phases. And Carrie talked about the preparation stage and how that, when all the work is done right here, the dialogue just does what it does and we fade into the background. If the prep work is done right and everybody's ready, you can't mess up the dialogue. This, again, we've talked about the actual dialogue stage, and then we always have a follow-up stage to check on people right away in the aftermath of it, because sometimes the emotions are so crazy for a couple days. We want to welfare check people and make sure that they've had a chance to breathe and absorb some of this. And then usually we'll follow up again in about a month after it's settled just a little bit. And some people we continue to talk to all the time. And for the offenders, I'll call their case manager and have them bring them in the office and talk to them, just to keep a gauge on how everybody's doing. I still get letters once in a while from offenders asking me, how's the program going? Is anybody else helping you now? And all that kind of stuff. So almost everybody we've done stuff with, I'm in touch with anyway. But that immediate follow-up is really important. And we've never had anybody react anything but positively. And I hope that that's how it continues. Yeah.
Have you had any participants attempt to get on visiting lists afterwards or try to maintain contact?
We've had a couple that want to maintain contact and write. And I've talked with the executive during the cases that I believe it's going to continue healing. And they've approved them to be able to write letters or have phone calls. Probably not ever going to start a visiting program in that regard, but Peggy, the blonde, her and the offender who killed her son are writing a book now. So they've continued the process. I would not want to see it happen if I thought there might be anything different that would come of it. Not everybody's asked for it. You know, some of them, Kelly, who her brother was killed, she got what she needed that day. She's done. She don't want to see him again. She's fine. These 2 believe that they're the only 2 that can make something positive happen from all this now. So case by case, we can approve that. Yes, sir.
So after the 1 4 to 6 hour facilitated event, that doesn't happen again, not even if the victim wants like another time just to answer either more questions or anything like that?
No, that's why the prep process is so important and takes so long, why we space those meetings out. We want them to think about everything, because we're only going to facilitate one dialogue. So we make sure that everything they can think of, bouncing questions back and forth, everything is there that day. We're not going to facilitate it again. And I think if we didn't approach it that way, we'd have people coming back 20 times trying to get more questions answered, and it's just not conducive to the process, because then we're starting a visiting program. So that's why prep is so extensive and takes so long. We want it, one time's all it's gonna happen.
So you ask them to bring questions and kind of guide them through their question development?
Well, we wanna know what their expectations are, and then we start kind of probing a little deeper with them and leave them things to think about. Come see them again in a few weeks. And usually as they process the stuff that they bounced off of us or that we've asked them, they start thinking of other things. And then we'll talk to the offender and bring some things back to that, and that, creates more back and forth and questions. So by the time we figured we've delved into everything that might come up, everything that's off the table, any unintended possibilities, when there's no more of that to work through and talk about, then we kind of know we're ready.
And it's
But-
also, yeah, excuse me, it's
No.
also not just the questions, it's digging down as what does it mean to you? The meaning and significance is really important. So it's taking it off of those superficial, even open-ended questions and taking it down a notch. And there's a process that we use for that.
And a lot of times the prep meetings end up being therapeutic, really. Because they'll start thinking of things they haven't talked to anybody else about. Their family may be sick of talking to them about it. They might not want to hear it anymore. So with us, it's all new to us. And they start processing and thinking about a lot of things that maybe they haven't said out loud. So you explore all those little things. We take notes and highlight stuff to go back to. And we give the offender an idea of what they're asking and what they're looking for. And then come back to them with where the offender's at. You may not be able to answer this question completely. How's that going to be for you? What if you can't remember? It gets pretty in-depth, and they can be 2 or 3 hours at a crack, and sometimes we do 4 or 5 of them. Try to get everything out there that might come up. So that's why the prep is so hugely important. If all that's nailed down, usually when the dialogue starts, the facilitators fade into the background and you don't need to do anything. So I think one back. This is that step-by-step thing I was talking about. The victim contacts me, and I spend some quality time talking to them to find out what it is they're looking for. I want to know if they have really specific questions, and sometimes people just want to go and tell them how this has affected their life. Sometimes they want questions answered. Most of the time, that's the bottom line. And then I explain exactly what the intent and the integrity of the process is and how it works, and let them sit and think about it for a minute. And I usually talk to them again a little bit later. But in the meantime, I'm researching that offender, seeing what all their risk assessment codes are, what their mental health codes are, what their institutional behavior's been, all those kind of things. I start snooping around on them, talking to the captain at the facility that I know, ask them how this guy behaves. Always looking at their mental health status and all the things that they've done while they've been in prison. And I always look for apology letters that they may have written for our apology letter bank. Like I look for the victim impact statements that maybe they've presented to the parole board. So I do a lot of research. None of it happens really quickly. And then I'll usually follow up with that victim and say, here's what happens next. I'm gonna go to the facility and see if this guy's amenable to the process. He doesn't have to do this. So Carrie was doing that for a victim yesterday. And like she said earlier, I don't want the staff to tell them I'm coming. I want to see what their initial reaction is when I look at them and say, I'm here on behalf of Peggy. And they know exactly who I'm talking about. And that initial reaction is huge. It's very telltale in, are they welcoming this? Did it freak them out? Do they do this to me? What do they do? And not yet have I had anybody say, oh my God, no way, and not be grateful for it. The most negative reaction I've had from an offender is, really? I'll think about it. That was the worst I got. Most of the time it's like, oh my God, really? I really want to do this. I couldn't do anything in court. I really want to do this. So if that's the textbook version, I've been really lucky. So far, that's what I've gotten. I'm sure it'll change as the numbers go up when we start seeing more cases, but so far it's all been received so well. Then I pick facilitators. Right now we're doing a dual facilitator model. There's 2 people that do these cases because they're all fairly newly trained facilitators. Plus it really helps to have somebody else to hear and think of questions and listen for things that maybe the other person has missed. So at that point, then I give them a case, give them all the information, call the warden and say, hey, these guys are coming out, we're gonna start some prep meetings, and I educate staff at the facilities about it so that everybody knows what's going on. Some things about our facilitators and how we manage that. I get to review and approve anybody that wants to do it, and I'm pretty selective about that too. It's, experience is a big deal. If people don't know anything about offender mentality or anything about that system, it can be really hard for them to come in and work with an offender and really know what they're saying. So there's lots of considerations I have to take in mind too. And we have 23 facilities and spread all over the state. So that's another consideration too, is logistical stuff.
Facilitator manipulation is an important consideration because offenders can be manipulative, and so you want to have an awareness to that. Just because their lip quivers and they tear up doesn't necessarily mean that that's really what is going on for them. And so being able to kind of see through some of that stuff and understand and help them really articulate where they are with it and their remorse is important.
Okay, we kind of talked about that already. There's the second layer of things that it does provide the offender. And I think one of the things that I've really come to see with this kind of a program is it's the one time in the criminal justice system where everybody wins. The victims get what they need, the offenders have an opportunity to do something they've never done before, and the community is receiving somebody that's probably a lot less likely to commit a crime. The man who stabbed his friend and nearly decapitated him, after spending 6 hours with Peggy, he said, oh my God, I don't even want to hurt anybody's feelings anymore. I really don't think that man's probably inclined to go back out and commit another heinous murder. Much less likely than he would be had he not had this opportunity. So everybody wins. That's my point in all this. Everybody wins.
So let's hear from, I believe,
This Bryce.
When I walked out of the room from the VOD, I knew that I had experienced something miraculous. That it was awesome. It was life-changing. I was never going to be the same again because I was able to put myself in Peggy's shoes. And I had never done that on my own. All of my thinking had been about my perspective and never hers.
heard from was the one who was high on the pain meds that pulled in front of motorcyclists. When we interviewed him, he said that this was Judgment Day for him. He thought that nothing could be more difficult or more challenging to have to look in the eyes of the person, the family members of the person that you killed.
That makes me think of something else
I think I wanted mostly
that I
for
think
Patty
that
just to,
the offenders realize after the dialogue. Nobody can hold them accountable truly, like sitting there face to face with the person they harmed or a survivor. The judge can give you a sentence but not necessarily make you accountable. The corrections officer in the cell house can try to make you accountable. All these things can happen. But sitting face to face with the person you harmed, there's no accountability like that. And I think Andy talked about something he really learned from the dialogue too was empathy. And like Rozier said, putting himself in her shoes, he'd never really thought about it just like that before. So it's a whole new level of accountability and understanding that these guys walk away with. And I think that's what makes them so much less likely to harm anybody when they come back to the community or even in prison. So
Monica,
Sorry.
how many offenders, when they come back, how many offenders will come back out to the community?
97% of the offenders in prison are coming back to the community.
So that's why this is so important, critical.
Yeah,
It's so
this-
important.
They're coming back to live in your community, period. That's just the way it is. Some of them, the very small percentage that have life without parole or death sentences is minimal.
So this is Andy talking about what he got out of it.
understand that I loved him, that I loved Elijah, and that also wanted them to understand that how much I had changed.
That's another common thing that we hear is how much I've changed. So, do you want to go on this one?
I think I pretty much
We've pretty much talked
Kinda-
about this.
given you all that already.
The studies show that if they've gone through a victim offender dialogue, recidivism drops to about 60% from the 97. So there have been some studies done, but we've not done anything in the state of Colorado. And there's been some studies that even low as around 30%. But they're not very comprehensive, and they're not very specific to this kind of a program, so that's why we don't really use that or throw those out there. I think the more important issue here is that it's an idea of trust. When someone has offended, they've broken the trust and they've torn the fabric of the community. And so how does not only the victim and the surviving family member trust, but how does the community trust that they won't do this again? And as the one man who was the vehicular homicide that was high on the pain med said to the family, you know, you've asked it, will I ever take drugs again? Will I ever drink again? I can sit here and tell you no. But the truth is that it's easy to say that while I'm in prison. What's really going to happen is when I'm out on the street and I'm approached with that. And he looked them in the eye and said, I guarantee you, I will never drink or take drugs again. I never want to hurt anyone again. And I realize what I've done. So for him, he basically said, how are you going to trust me? I can give you my word, but we've got to give these people opportunities to rebuild the trust. And so we know if they've reoffended, if they're out on parole, obviously they're back in again. So that's one way we can measure, but once they're off parole, we really don't have a mechanism.
Yeah, I had a chance to go to San Juan years ago. And I met a boy, and he'd been in prison for 20 years. And he had gotten high, and while he was tweaking, he shot his sister with a shot-off shotgun and killed her. And so his victim translated as his mama. And he went through some kind of similar program that was out of Berkeley, actually. There was a lot of programs that were coming into that prison out of the universities in San Francisco. And it was something like this. It wasn't the same translation. But he hadn't seen his mother in 20 years. And he was telling me how impactful it was, and he was about to actually see the parole board. It was translated as murder scene. And so, but he was communicating. That was the first time I ever had talked to an offender about victim impact. But it was his mother, that victim, and that was the first time I'd ever kind of translated any kind of family member as a victim. So I wanted to ask you if you've had any cases like that, where the victim was somebody close to that offender like that.
Very often those murder victims are family members.
Yeah, that blew me away.
Sometimes
I
it's
never
strange.
really
Yeah.
considered that.
Yeah, and that makes the dynamics really strange.
Right.
When it's somebody that is a stranger, the dynamics are completely different. So, yeah, it's a factor for sure.
It's a fascinating field to work in. It really is. The dynamics of this are just amazing. If they don't take accountability, we don't see as a victim offender dialogue. In an interview that I had yesterday, and this was an interesting one because there were some cultural implications. The offender was from South America, and so his response was not as exciting or as expansive as I thought it would be, but I attributed that to his cultural background. And one of the things that he said initially, I said, I'm here on behalf of the family, and I said, does that name ring a bell for you? Is that familiar? And he goes, oh yes, that was the accident. And that term accident kind of makes your skin crawl just a little bit. And I said, so what do you think about that? He goes, I didn't mean to do it. I didn't mean to do it. I was only addicted to beer. Again, another minimization that's a red flag for us. But as we started to open up the conversation and kind of peel back some of the questions, and I said, what do you want them to know from you? And he said, how deeply sorry I am that I took their family. I can't fix it. I want to fix it, but I can't they're excited, they're nervous, they're anxious, they're a little bit uneasy about facing that victim's family. So the subtleties are really important in this work, but as CJ professionals, what I would really encourage you to think about is when because you're dealing primarily with offenders, is to really take a look at what's going on for the victims. Because oftentimes they're sidelined, and they are not empowered, and they don't get a lot of information that maybe you as a CJ professional in the case might have, that they don't know about this stuff. And so they've tried to fill in the blanks, and that's where some of the anger is rooted in, is this misunderstanding and not knowing. So the clarity is just so critical, but you have to go down to the meaning level, not just the words. I think hit on that a few times. Do you want to talk about these? These are some of the comments.
I think the first one is from Patty, whose son Elijah was killed in the DUI crash by Andy. And we hear some of these common threads. Everybody that we've talked to has said something similar, that the huge weight has been lifted and finally some relief and some peace. Obviously, the second one is a really common one also. Carrie talked a little bit about imagining and plugging holes into the story, and knowing the truth has allowed me to now process the truth. And they all say it's so much easier just to know the truth. People often ask, why would a mother want to know how her son got stabbed to death? Why would she want to know all those gruesome details? Well, because she'd been playing all these different scenarios in her head for 19 years that wouldn't stop because she didn't know. And it's easier to process the truth, as awful as it may be, compared to processing a bunch of stories you don't know what the right one is. So that's how it healed her. Those tapes stopped playing in her head. She finally slept good that night. I think she wasn't wondering how Jimmy died. She knew. Now she could manage it. She could put it in place and process it.
And what was interesting about that case is that the offender did not want to give her those details because he thought they would hurt her again. And he said, I've done so much pain and damage, I don't want to hurt her again. And yet that's the one thing she had to have were those answers. And so bringing the two of them together at a place, I mean, I remember the tension in the room of, okay, now we're going to go into this. Are you okay? Can you do this? And I remember him taking a deep breath. He's like, okay. And then while she's listening to this, her lip is quivering. I mean, her eyes are watering. She's reliving that horrible, horrible moment. But she had to go through that. For her, she had to go through the fire to get out on the other side. And that was the comment that she made to me. This is the first time I've slept well in 19 years, the next day when I talked to her. And then the offender in that case said, this will change a man's heart. And he's been a real cheerleader of the program in the prison.
Yeah, this guy's housed at Arkansas Valley. And we take victim impact panels into the facilities where I have people from the Crime Victim Advisory Council in Denver. And they come and tell their stories. They have little 3 to 5 minute DVDs that they share their experience with violent crime in their family. It's all on YouTube. If you ever wanted to use them, they're really great stories. CVAC Denver, if you search on YouTube. And those folks come out and tell their stories. And this guy is at every one of them. And any classes that we're aware of where people are learning about restorative justice, I've taken 3 or 4 groups out to the facility. Many times it's folks who've done work in restorative justice programs in schools or on lower levels, and they come to prison and see the epitome, the top end of the continuum of restorative justice. He's like my RJ poster boy, and every opportunity that he can do something to help us, that's what he's doing. So he's trying to pay some forward as well. He's encouraging other offenders at AV to write apology letters. And a lot of them are the ones that write letters to me asking if they could do the dialogue program. So that ripple effect has changed patterns, and now he's doing something positive with it. So I don't see anybody that doesn't win through a situation like that. And then the last comment too is, little did I know the impact this would have. And every offender that's gone through it has said the same generic thing to me. I had no idea how much this would help me. So,
I think what would be good is to see if there's any questions, and if, because I know there's some transition here and some class changes, but if you would like to see the rough cut of the DVD that is coming out, we need to get online to pull it down to Dropbox, but it is powerful, because you hear both the victims and the offenders, and you won't get that pixelation, so if you want to do that.
how much time do we have, Kate? Are you ready to kick us out yet?
It's 11:30.
Yeah, it's 11:30. How long is it?
Can you repeat the resource, CVAC or CVAC?
It's, the acronym is from Crime Victim Advisory Council, CVAC. And if you're in YouTube, you can type in CVAC Denver. And there's about 8 videos there that have been made by the Denver DA's office. And these folks go to halfway houses and speak. They go to juvenile facilities and speak and tell their stories. There are cases of murder, rape, vehicular homicide, domestic violence, a variety of different kinds of perspectives of how violent crime have affected people. One of them that actually coordinates some of those meetings for us was a rape victim of Brent Brent's. Does anybody remember who that is? He was a serial rapist that got the largest sentence ever handed down in the state of Colorado until James Holmes. He got sent to 1,600 years. He was raping little kids and stuffing them in trash cans when he was a kid. He went through a week-long spree in Denver where he raped, I think, 9 people. My friend Rebecca was one of those who does a snippet DVD about her case. He raped a grandmother and her 2 grandchildren in one day, and 2 other people, and then Rebecca that same day. And she's one of them that actually comes into the prisons with me and talks about what violent crime has done in her life. So, very often that's a way that victims will continue their healing process, out there speaking and trying to prevent anybody else from being harmed and sharing their stories to shed some light on what it can really do in devastating lives. So